It was the autumn of 1839 when the name Nathaniel Gray first appeared in the local press. The small New England town of Merrifield had seen its share of strange events, whispered ghost sightings, mysterious illnesses, and the occasional traveling preacher proclaiming the end of days, but nothing quite like this. The air carried the smell of wood smoke, and the streets, slick with the remnants of a recent rain, glistened under the pale moonlight. Nathaniel was not a man of renown before that year. A 34-year-old schoolteacher with an average life, his reputation was one of modest intellect and quiet demeanor. That is, until the day he told a gathering at the town's general store that he could remember his death. He claimed, in a voice calm yet heavy, that not only had he died before he remembered the pain, the fading of light, and the sound of his own heart slowing to a stop. The townsfolk reacted with equal parts intrigue and unease. For a place steeped in Protestant values, where life and death were firmly believed to be in God's hands, such a claim was not merely strange, it was borderline blasphemous. Word spread quickly. People began stopping him on the dirt road to his modest home, asking for details. He didn't shy away from answering. He spoke of drowning not in this lifetime, but another, describing with unnerving clarity the cold rush of water filling his lungs, the muffled roar in his ears, and the stillness that followed. To him it wasn't a dream or a vision, it was memory. By the week's end, his story had traveled beyond Merrifield, carried in letters and recounted by travelers to neighboring towns. The local newspaper, the Merrifield Chronicle, ran the headline, "Schoolmaster claims death twice over, is it madness or miracle?" This was an era before the widespread influence of spiritualist movements, yet the seed of curiosity was planted. Nathaniel's life would never again be ordinary. Nathaniel's first detailed recounting of his so-called previous death happened in the parlor of Mrs. Eliza Carrow, a widowed seamstress known for hosting evening gatherings. Her parlor was dimly lit by 2 oil lamps, the flicker casting long shadows against the faded floral wallpaper. Around a dozen townsfolk were present, sipping tea and waiting for Nathaniel to speak. When he began, his voice carried a peculiar steadiness. He described the setting of his other life, a coastal village he swore was not Merrifield, nor any place he had visited in his present lifetime. The year, as far as he could guess, was sometime in the late 1700s. He said he had been a fisherman, a man named Elias Turner, with a wife named Margaret and a young son. The night of his death had been bitterly cold, the sea restless under a rising storm. He recalled going out despite his wife's protests, needing to bring in one last haul before the season ended. The waves were violent, the sky a solid sheet of darkness broken only by flashes of lightning. He spoke of the moment the boat capsized, his body hurled into icy water, the shock of cold seizing his muscles. As the waves dragged him under, he said his thoughts were not of survival, but of his wife's face and the knowledge he would never see her again. The final moments were the most disturbing to the listeners. He described the silence beneath the water, how the storm's roar above became muted, and how the world narrowed to darkness. Then, Nathaniel said, there was nothing. No thought, no breath, just the stillness. Until I awoke in this life. Some in the room gasped quietly. Others whispered prayers under their breath. Mrs. Carrow's teacup rattled slightly on its saucer as she set it down. For the deeply religious in attendance, the story bordered on heresy. Yet there was something undeniably genuine in the way Nathaniel spoke, something that made even skeptics lean forward to hear every word. By the time the gathering ended, few believed Nathaniel entirely. Others dismissed him as fanciful or touched in the head, but all left with his story imprinted in their minds. For Nathaniel, this was only the beginning. The more he spoke, the more vivid his memory seemed to become. And the more the town began to view him as either a prophet or a madman. Asterisk on the morning of September 14th, 1839, the streets of Charleston bustled with their usual rhythm, horses' hooves striking the cobblestones, market vendors shouting over the clamor, and the faint smell of salt from the harbor riding the breeze. It was a day like any other until Nathaniel Gray was seen walking into town. At first, no one paid him much mind. His boots were caked with dried mud, and his clothes hung loosely as though they hadn't been worn for months. But when Mrs. Callahan, the seamstress who lived above the apothecary, caught sight of his face, she let out a sharp cry. The man she saw was not just familiar, he was supposed to be dead. 3 months earlier, Nathaniel had been declared drowned. His small fishing boat had been found adrift after a sudden storm swept through the harbor. The wreckage showed no sign of him. His funeral had been held, his grave marked. Yet here he was, standing in broad daylight, his skin pale, his eyes carrying an unsettling clarity as if he had looked upon something no living man should see. Witnesses described his movements as slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, like someone testing the ground beneath their feet for the first time. A group gathered around him, asking where he had been, if he had been rescued. Nathaniel answered each question the same way. I don't know where I was, but I remember what happened after I died. The words silenced the crowd. In a deeply religious Charleston, to speak of death in such terms was unsettling, if not outright dangerous. The town's minister, Reverend Samuel Price, was summoned at once. Nathaniel was escorted to the church, where the Reverend questioned him in private. When they emerged an hour later, Price's expression was grim. He offered no explanation, only urging the townsfolk to pray for Mr. Gray's soul and to give him space. But the Reverend's eyes betrayed something else, fear, or perhaps uncertainty. That day marked the beginning of Charleston's most whispered mystery. Some believed Nathaniel was a victim of mistaken death, saved at the last moment and left with strange visions. Others whispered darker theories, that he had crossed a boundary no man should cross and somehow returned. Asterisk in the months following his unsettling statement, Nathaniel Gray's life did not simply return to the quiet rhythm of a coastal town. Instead, a peculiar pattern began to surface, one that would draw the attention, curiosity, and fear of those around him. It started subtly. A neighbor's elderly father fell gravely ill. Nathaniel, standing at the bedside, reportedly turned to the man's daughter and whispered, "He will see the river again before he leaves us." Hours later, as the old man drifted in and out of consciousness, he muttered something about crossing a river and then passed away before dawn. Stories like this began to multiply. Nathaniel, it seemed, had developed, or perhaps always possessed, an uncanny ability to know the final hours of those near death. He never claimed to summon the knowledge deliberately. Rather, it was as though the awareness simply arrived, uninvited, like an unwelcome guest at the edge of his mind. On several occasions he described visions, fleeting images of dark water, fading light, or voices calling from a place no living man could name. The townsfolk began to treat him differently. Some approached him with morbid curiosity, asking about their own fate, as though hoping for proof that life continued beyond the grave. Others avoided him entirely, crossing the street to escape his gaze, fearing that if he looked at them too long, they might soon find themselves in a coffin. Rumors sprouted that Nathaniel had made a bargain with something not of this world, that his accident in the storm had been less a rescue from death than a trade. Nathaniel, for his part, did not relish the attention. He grew withdrawn, rarely lingering in public places, and when questioned about his strange perceptions, he often gave evasive answers. "It's not a gift," he told one fisherman over a pint at the tavern. It's a shadow that follows me. Sometimes it speaks. By the autumn of 1840, his reputation had spread beyond the town. Visitors from neighboring villages came seeking him, some out of desperation to speak with lost loved ones, others driven by a fascination with the morbid. Whether he liked it or not, Nathaniel Gray was no longer simply a man who had cheated. Death, he was becoming something else entirely, a man who could see it coming. The first week after Nathaniel Gray's return was filled with polite fascination. Neighbors came to call, offering pies, firm handshakes, and sidelong glances. In small towns, novelty was both a welcome distraction and a potential threat. At first, his tales were the stuff of winter's evening entertainment stories shared over cider and firelight. But soon, beneath the smiles and nods, a quieter current began to form. It started with a single remark, spoken by Mrs. Temperance Boyd at the Sunday service. While standing in the shadow of the church porch, she murmured to another parishioner that Nathaniel's eyes seemed different. "He looks at you," she whispered, "as though he's seeing a part of you you've hidden from yourself." That comment found fertile soil in a community where superstition still tangled with Scripture. The doubt deepened when young Samuel Rourke claimed Nathaniel had told him about a dream Samuel had suffered the night before down to the smallest, most private detail. Nathaniel brushed it off, saying he must have overheard something from Samuel's mother, but the boy insisted he'd told no one. By mid-February, rumors whispered through the tavern and the mill. Some said Nathaniel's return was unnatural. Others thought he might be blessed with visions from God. The most troubling talk came from the blacksmith, who swore that Nathaniel could predict when customers would arrive, often before they even set foot on the main road. The most devout townsfolk began to avoid him. Reverend Pritchard visited one cold morning, Bible in hand, to see if the Lord's peace was upon him. Nathaniel welcomed him warmly, speaking of faith with such ease and insight that even the Reverend was momentarily disarmed. Yet as he left, the minister confessed to his wife that he had felt a strange weight in the room, as though some invisible presence lingered behind Nathaniel's words. For Nathaniel, the shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable. Invitations grew fewer, conversations cut short when he entered. Children stared from doorways but scurried away if he approached. He had returned expecting to rebuild his life perhaps, even find companionship, but instead he found himself an object of suspicion, perched on the narrow edge between curiosity and fear. It was in this growing shadow of doubt that Nathaniel began to sense the first real danger, not from illness, or from the memories of death itself, but from the people whose acceptance he needed most. By the spring of 1840, Nathaniel Gray's reputation had grown well beyond the borders of Portsmouth. Whispers of the man who died and returned had traveled upriver and down the coast, carried by merchants, fishermen, and itinerant preachers. It was during this time that the most unsettling chapter of his story began, the arrival of the visitors in the night. The first incident took place on an unusually warm April evening. Nathaniel had retired early, exhausted after a day spent mending nets with his neighbor. As the town's lanterns dimmed and the harbor fell into stillness, a soft knocking echoed through his front door. It was not the urgent pounding of trouble, nor the friendly rap of a neighbor. It was slow, deliberate, and rhythmic, as though the knocker were measuring the seconds between each strike. Nathaniel, candle in hand, opened the door to find no one there. The street was empty, save for the mist curling low over the cobblestones. He stepped outside, the boards of his porch creaking underfoot, and scanned the shadows between the houses. Nothing stirred. But just as he turned to go back in, he heard, it faint but distinct, the sound of someone breathing just beyond the edge of the light. Over the following weeks, the incidents multiplied. Sometimes it was the knocking. Other times, there were whispers, snatches of unintelligible language seeping through the shutters in the dead of night. More than once, Nathaniel caught the fleeting silhouette of a tall figure at the end of his lane, motionless, watching. He began to keep the lamp burning through the night, yet even in its flickering glow, the presence remained. His sleep grew shallow, haunted by dreams of his own body lying cold in a casket while unseen hands reached down to touch his face. Each morning he awoke with the same cold dampness on his skin, as though the fog itself had been inside his home. The town's minister advised prayer. Nathaniel's physician suggested he was suffering from a nervous condition, but Nathaniel knew neither diagnosis fit. There was someone out there that seemed to know his story too well, something that arrived only after his death and returned God by midsummer. Nathaniel began to suspect a terrible truth. The visitors in the night were not strangers at all. It was the evening of July 14th, 1840, when Nathaniel Gray finally saw one of them clearly. The night air was heavy with the smell of salt and low tide, and the fog rolled in so thick that the street lamps burned as pale halos in the gloom. Nathaniel sat by his front window, refusing to sleep, determined to catch whatever had been haunting him for months. Just after midnight, movement stirred in the mist. At first it seemed no more than a shifting shadow, but then the figure stepped into view, tall, lean, and clothed entirely in black. The most striking feature was the wide-brimmed hat, so broad it nearly hid the man's face. Yet Nathaniel could make out the faint glint of eyes beneath. Watching his house with unblinking intensity, the figure stood in perfect stillness for several minutes, as though listening for something. Then, in a slow and deliberate motion, he raised his head toward Nathaniel's window. For a moment their eyes met, or at least Nathaniel felt they did, though the stranger's face was obscured in shadow. A wave of cold passed through him, the same cold he had felt the night he awoke from death. The man in the wide-brimmed hat did not speak. He merely reached into his coat and withdrew a small object, a length of cord, nodded 3 times, and placed it carefully on the ground. Then, without a sound, he stepped backward into the fog until he was gone. When Nathaniel dared to open the door and retrieve the object, he found the cord was damp, smelling faintly of river water. The knots were tight and deliberate, and for reasons he could not explain, the sight of them filled him with dread. He tucked it away, meaning to burn it, but in the days that followed, he discovered it had vanished from the drawer where he kept it. After that night, the visits changed, the knocking stopped, the whispers ceased. But the man in the wide-brimmed hat would appear without warning, at the market, on the wharf, in the alley behind the church, never speaking, never drawing closer, always watching. Nathaniel began to fear not the idea that he had been followed home from death, but that he had been claimed. The first time Nathaniel heard the man in the wide-brimmed hat speak, it wasn't with a voice, it was with a whisper that seemed to bypass the air entirely. It happened on a moonless night when Charleston's streets were nearly empty. Nathaniel had been returning from a late errand at the harbor, his satchel heavy with ledgers for the church accounts. The smell of brine clung to him, and the tide's distant crash was the only sound. Then came the click of a boot heel behind him, not hurried, not cautious, just steady, deliberate. He turned, but the street was empty, only the fog curling in the gaslight. He pressed on, heart thudding, until he reached a narrow stretch between 2 buildings. And there he was. The man in the wide-brimmed hat stepped forward, his face still lost in shadow. Nathaniel froze. His first thought was to run, but his legs refused. The whisper came not from the man's mouth, but as though it was breathed directly into Nathaniel's ear. You left something behind. Nathaniel swallowed hard. What? The man tilted his head slightly as if amused. They sent me to collect it. His tone was neither threatening nor kind, just inevitable. Nathaniel's mind raced. Was this about the knotted cord? About something from that night on the water? Before he could speak again, the man reached into his coat. For one dreadful moment, Nathaniel imagined a pistol or a blade. Instead, the man withdrew a folded scrap of paper, yellowed and brittle. He held it out. Nathaniel hesitated before taking it. It was blank. Completely blank. He looked up to question him, but the man was already stepping backward, fading into the mist. The final whisper followed Nathaniel home like a lingering chill. When you can read it, you'll know where to go. That night, Nathaniel lit a candle and stared at the paper for hours. It remained blank. Yet sometimes, out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw faint lines like ink that only revealed itself when it wanted to be seen. For days afterward, he carried it everywhere, waiting for the words to appear. He didn't yet understand that the message wouldn't reveal itself where he was. But when 3 days passed before the paper stirred, it was in the still hours before dawn, when the last of the night candles had burned down to stubs. Nathaniel had dozed in his chair, his chin resting against his chest, the blank scrap balanced on his knee. Outside, the rain had slowed to a faint patter, and the whole house seemed to breathe with the storm. A sharp crack of thunder woke him. The paper slid to the floor. As he bent to retrieve it, he froze there in the wavering candlelight. Something had changed. Letters, thin, spidery, and brown as dried blood, were appearing across the surface. They did not bloom like fresh ink, but seemed to rise slowly from beneath the fibers of the paper, as if they had been buried within it all along. The words formed in jagged, uneven lines. Not all who are lost are gone. The door is not where it should be. Follow the bells. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. The handwriting was unfamiliar, though something about its sharp strokes felt oddly purposeful, more carved than written. He traced the letters with his fingertip. They were faintly raised, like old engravings. Then, without warning, the ink began to fade. Nathaniel's breath caught. He grabbed his pen and frantically copied the lines into his ledger before they could vanish. By the time he looked back, the paper was blank once more. What did it mean? The first phrase, "Not all who are lost are gone," struck him like a whisper from a grave. The second hinted at a place he had never noticed, a door that wasn't where it belonged. And the third, the bells. Charleston was a city of bells, church bells marking the hours, harbor bells ringing for incoming ships, even the distant clang from the watchman's patrols. But which bells? And why should he follow them? His mind turned to the old steeple of St. Aldrich's, a church long abandoned, its bells silent for decades. Yet locals claimed that on certain stormy nights they could be heard ringing without a soul in the tower. Nathaniel didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in signs. And now the bells were calling him. By sunrise, he had decided he would go to St. Aldrich's at night. And whatever waited behind that door, not a door, he would face it. It was a quiet morning in Charleston when Dr. Samuel Hargrove's maid entered his study holding a small, yellowed envelope. "This came for you, sir," she said, her brow furrowed. The letter had no return address, only his name scrawled in a tight, almost nervous hand. Hargrove, who had been consumed by his investigation into Nathaniel Gray's strange memories, broke the seal and carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The first line made his blood run cold. "You seek the truth of a man who claims to remember his own death? I was there." The writer went on to describe a night in 1839, a night of violence and fear, where a group of townsfolk had gathered in an abandoned coastal inn to confront a man accused of unspeakable crimes. They claimed this man's name was Elias Thatcher, and that he had died at the stroke of midnight after being shot in the chest. The description of the man matched Nathaniel Gray in uncanny detail, from the scar under his jaw to the peculiar way he favored his left leg. Hargrove reread the letter several times, his mind spinning. Was this proof that Nathaniel was the reincarnation of someone who had truly died decades before? Or was this just a cruel prank, meant to feed the hysteria that had begun to grow around Gray? The handwriting was jagged, the ink uneven, as though the author's hand had trembled with either age or fear. At the bottom of the page, there was a single instruction. If you want answers, meet me by the old wharf at midnight when the tide is low. Come alone. For the rest of the day, Hargrove couldn't focus on anything else. He paced his study, wondering whether to share the letter with Nathaniel or keep it to himself until he confirmed its authenticity. The dangers were obvious. Charleston's docks were not a place for polite society after dark, and a midnight meeting could easily be a trap stop. As the evening drew near, Hargrove made his choice. He slipped the letter into the inner pocket of his coat, wrapped himself in a heavy wool cloak, and left his house without telling a soul. Outside, the wind carried the smell of salt and decay from the sea. Each step toward the wharf seemed to pull him deeper into a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to find. The clock in St. Michael's Tower struck 11 as he approached the waterfront, the sound echoing across the empty streets. Somewhere beyond the fog, the tide was turning, and with it, perhaps, the story of Nathaniel Gray's impossible past. By the early spring of 1840, Nathaniel Gray's name had traveled beyond the borders of his quiet hometown. His story, first whispered in candlelit parlors and exchanged over mugs of steaming coffee in the local tavern, had begun to appear in letters sent to academic circles in Boston, New York, and even across the Atlantic, while most scholars dismissed. It is nothing more than another strange American folk tale. One man took an interest, Professor Alistair Pembroke of Harvard University. Pembroke was a man whose reputation was built upon chasing and sometimes debunking extraordinary claims. He had spent decades cataloging curious medical phenomena, unexplained dreams, and uncanny mental abilities. Yet Nathaniel's case seemed to stand apart from the usual hoaxes and eccentricities he encountered. Pembroke arrived in Grayford on an overcast morning, stepping down from the stagecoach with a leather satchel, a stack of well-worn notebooks, and an expression of quiet skepticism. The townsfolk, curious as ever, watched from doorways and windows as the scholarly stranger made his way toward the modest home where Nathaniel now lived with his sister. By this time, Nathaniel's demeanor had changed. He was quieter, more guarded, his once confident voice now slow and deliberate, as if every word he spoke was weighed against some invisible truth. Inside the small parlor, the professor introduced himself and explained his purpose plainly. "I do not come to mock you, Mr. Gray," Pembroke said in a low voice, "but to understand if indeed there is something to be understood." Nathaniel studied the man for a long moment, then nodded. Over the next 3 days, Pembroke questioned him meticulously. He took notes as Nathaniel described the cold clarity of the moment he claimed to have died, the sensation of floating above his own body, and the overwhelming flood of memories that felt as though they belonged to someone else entirely. Nathaniel spoke of landscapes he had never visited, of faces he did not recognize yet felt he knew intimately. He recounted a cena room with high-arched windows, sunlight spilling across an oak desk so vividly that Pembroke found himself sketching it from Nathaniel's words alone, but Pembroke's scholarly rigor could not prevent a strange unease from settling over him. On the final night, as he reviewed his notes by lamplight, he felt an odd shiver when he realized that one of Nathaniel's memories matched, in uncanny detail, an obscure case recorded in a European manuscript Pembroke had studied years before. The manuscript had never been published, and Nathaniel could not possibly have seen it. That realization left the professor staring at his notes long after the candle burned low. wondering whether he had stumbled into something that defied every scientific explanation he knew. 3 days after Nathaniel's final fit in the apothecary, the Reverend Silas Morton arrived at the Gray household. Morton was not a man easily swayed by rumor or superstition. His sermons often criticized the foolish indulgence of ghost stories. Yet he had heard enough whispers about Nathaniel's condition to warrant a pastoral call. His black coat, still dusted with snow, seemed to swallow the dim light of the parlor as he stepped inside. Mrs. Gray, pale and worn, offered him tea but could hardly hide her anxiety. "It's not just his dreams, Reverend," she said, her voice trembling. "He speaks as though he's someone else, someone who has lived and died before." Morton frowned at this, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He had heard tales of remembered lives from missionaries returning from the East, but never from a respectable New England boy of Nathaniel's upbringing. Nathaniel was brought in from the adjoining room, wrapped in a quilt despite the heat from the hearth. The boy's eyes fixed on Morton with unnerving clarity, as if seeing someone he had known long ago. Morton began gently, reading from the Psalms, but Nathaniel interrupted in a low, steady voice. "You read those words as if they are new to me? I heard them from the lips of another." "In a place where the air stank of burning," Morton's reading faltered. "What place do you mean, son?" he asked. Nathaniel blinked slowly, then replied, "I cannot tell you the name, for the name is dust, but I remember dying there. My lungs, they would not fill. My hands were tied." Mrs. Gray gasped and clutched her apron. Morton, unsettled but determined, pressed further. "You are speaking nonsense born of fever, Nathaniel." The boy smiled faintly, almost pityingly, and said, "Perhaps, but I know the taste of death, Reverend, and it is not the end." The rest of the visit passed in strained politeness, with Morton praying over Nathaniel and urging the family to keep faith. Yet when he stepped back into the cold night, the Reverend's mind was anything but at peace. He replayed the boy's words, the conviction in them. Morton had tended to the sick, the dying, the delusional, but this was different. It was not the ravings of a fevered mind, but the testimony of someone who seemed to have truly been there that night. Morton wrote a letter to an old seminary colleague in Boston, describing the case in guarded terms. He did not yet realize it, but his inquiry would soon draw attention far beyond their quiet village. The morning after Nathaniel Gray's astonishing account of his return from death, a respected figure in the town, Dr. Elias Turner, was summoned to evaluate him. Turner was not a man prone to superstition. He had served as a field surgeon during the Seminole Wars and had seen more than enough death to know when a body was beyond recall. He approached Nathaniel with a cautious, almost clinical demeanor. "You say you were dead," he began, voice firm but not unkind. "I must determine if what you claim is physically possible or if this is merely the product of delirium." The townsfolk gathered quietly outside the small parlor where the examination took place. They pressed their ears to the cracked doorframe, straining to catch fragments of the conversation. Turner first checked Nathaniel's pulse, his pupils, his reflexes making note of the steadiness of the heartbeat, the clarity of his eyes, the absence of fever. "No sign of lingering illness," Turner murmured, almost to himself. Then came the questions, precise, deliberate, probing. "Describe the last thing you saw before your cessation." Nathaniel's gaze grew distant, a blur of light. But not sunlight. It was softer, almost silver. Then nothing. No sound, no breath, no thought. And then the voice. His tone carried neither fear nor excitement, but the calm of a man speaking plain truth. Turner recorded each word in a neat, slanted script. The doctor's pen paused only once. When Nathaniel described seeing the river from above and recognizing the exact layout of the mill's roof, the roof he could not have seen from the ground that day, when the examination ended, Turner stepped out into the street. The crowd leaned forward eagerly. "Well?" someone asked. Turner hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. "His body bears no sign of illness. His mind is lucid. I cannot explain how he lives, but I will not say he lies." His words carried weight. Turner's reputation for sober judgment meant the townspeople could not dismiss Nathaniel as a fraud. Yet privately the doctor's mind swirled with doubts. That evening, in the dim glow of his study, he reviewed his notes again and again. One phrase in Nathaniel's account troubled him most. "The voice told me I must return, for my time was not yet marked." The statement implied intent that something or someone beyond the grave had chosen to send him back. And if that were true, the question became unavoidable. Why? By late summer of 1839, the strange tale of Nathaniel Gray had reached the ears of Dr. Horace Olcott, a scholar of both theology and the fledgling field of mesmeric studies. Olcott was a tall, angular man with a sharp gaze and a voice that could cut through the murmur of a crowded hall. He traveled from Boston to the quiet coastal town with a singular purpose: to determine whether Gray's memory of death was a mere delusion or a genuine phenomenon worthy of record. Dr. Olcott did not arrive alone. He brought with him a leather satchel stuffed with notebooks, charcoal pencils, and a curious brass device he claimed could measure the soul's influence upon the body. Townsfolk eyed him with both suspicion and fascination. Many had grown weary of outsiders meddling in the affair, but some secretly hoped this scholar might offer a logical explanation, or at the very least a conclusion to the mystery that had shadowed their streets for months. Upon meeting Nathaniel, Olcott was struck by the man's composure. Far from the trembling wreck many expected, Nathaniel greeted him with a firm handshake and a level gaze. "You come to test me, Dr. Olcott," he said plainly. "But I will tell you now, there are things I remember that no living man should." The room fell silent at those words, and Olcott scribbled something in his notebook before replying, "Then you must be prepared to tell them, one by one, with nothing omitted." Over the next several days, the scholar subjected Nathaniel to a rigorous series of interviews. He asked him to recount the sensations of death, the sequence of events after the moment of his last heartbeat, and the nature of the places he claimed to have seen. Nathaniel spoke of corridors without walls, of a light that burned but did not blind, and of voices dozens, perhaps hundreds, whispering in languages he could not identify yet somehow understood. Olcott compared these descriptions to writings from ancient mystics, medieval visionaries, and the accounts of sailors pulled back from drowning. He noted similarities but also details unique to Nathaniel's testimony, details so specific they could not be explained away by coincidence. The scholar began to waver in his skepticism, though he concealed it behind a wall of polite inquiry. On the evening of the 7th day, Olcott emerged from his lodgings and addressed a small gathering outside the inn. "I have found no deception in Nathaniel Gray," he announced. "If his tale is untrue, then it is untrue to a depth the human mind has yet to fathom." The townspeople whispered amongst themselves, their curiosity reignited, but Olcott's words carried a subtle warning one that suggested the truth, whatever it was, might be far stranger than they dared to believe. The night of October 9, 1839, began with a strange stillness over the village of Ashford. The wind that had whispered through the eaves all day was gone, replaced by an eerie, expectant quiet. The only sounds were the creak of swinging tavern signs and the muffled toll of the church bell, marking the 9th hour. Inside the Gray residence, Nathaniel sat in a straight-backed chair beside his bed, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. He had been speaking less in recent days, his voice turning hoarse, his energy waning. Yet his eyes, those deep, unsettling eyes, seemed to grow sharper, as if they were seeing something beyond the room. His wife, Margaret, kept to the far corner, sewing in silence, her needle flashing in the lamplight. She had told herself she stayed to keep watch, but the truth was, she feared leaving him alone, or worse, feared what she might find if she returned to an empty chair. Nathaniel's breathing was steady, almost too steady, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of a man at peace. But then, without warning, he spoke. "It's here," he murmured. Margaret looked up from her sewing. "What's here, Nathaniel?" He didn't answer her directly. Instead, he stared at the far wall as though it had become transparent. The river, the black water. "I hear them calling again." Margaret stood, her chair scraping the floor. "Don't talk like that. You're frightening me." Nathaniel turned his gaze to her, his expression softening. "It will be over quickly this time. No light, just quiet." Those were the last words he spoke. Moments later his body went rigid, his hands clutching the arms of the chair. His breathing halted, his face drained of all color, and then silence. Margaret's cry echoed through the small house, summoning neighbors from the street. The physician, Dr. Harris, arrived within minutes, carrying his worn leather bag. He placed 2 fingers at Nathaniel's neck, then pressed his ear to his chest. Finally, with a grim shake of his head, he pronounced the same man dead for the second time in less than a year. The villagers, now crowding the doorway, stood in stunned disbelief. The air seemed heavy, charged, as if some unseen thing had just passed through the room. If Nathaniel's first death had been a curiosity, this one would soon be spoken of as a curse. By the spring of 1840, Nathaniel Gray's story had begun to fade from the headlines, replaced by fresher scandals and the restless march of political news. Yet, among those who had known him, friends, fellow villagers, and the few who had investigated his strange claims, there remained an undercurrent of unease. For while the public might have moved on, whispers persisted in drawing rooms and taverns. Nathaniel had spoken of things no man should have known, and some believed he had confessed more than was ever recorded. It was said that shortly before his second and final disappearance from public life, Nathaniel had a series of private conversations, select, almost ritualistic in their secrecy, with individuals he trusted. One of these was a schoolteacher from the neighboring county, a man named Edwin Harper. Harper, in later years, would recall in a letter that Nathaniel spoke of a white chamber, a room not of this world, where he stood surrounded by shadows that called him by name. In this place, Nathaniel claimed there was no sense of time, only a constant awareness of every action he had ever taken, good and bad replayed with perfect clarity. Another of these whispered confidences came to a midwife, Margaret Ellison, who swore Nathaniel described 2 deaths. The first, he said, was the one everyone knew about, the drowning in 1839, from which he somehow returned. The second was yet to come, and he spoke of it as if it were inevitable, even scheduled, though he would not share the date. To Margaret's horror, Nathaniel described in eerie detail the smell of damp soil and the taste of iron in his mouth, sensations he insisted would accompany his real passing. Rumors also held that Nathaniel's confessions were not entirely verbal. A few claimed he had written down fragments of what he remembered, cryptic symbols, partial sentences, and strange diagrams that looked like constellations but did not match the night sky. If these writings existed, they vanished with him. By the time summer arrived, Nathaniel was seen less and less. Those who did catch sight of him reported a gaunter figure, a man whose eyes were always darting to the corners of rooms as if expecting someone or something to arrive. And then, as quietly as he had reappeared after his first death, Nathaniel Gray was gone once more. leaving behind only the whispered echoes of his final confessions. Nathaniel Gray's second vanishing did not carry the drama of his first. There were no panicked crowds on the riverbank, no witnesses to a tragic accident, no frantic search parties combing the countryside. It was, in fact, a quieter kind of mystery, the sort that slips unnoticed through the cracks of ordinary life, until someone suddenly realizes the person in question is simply not there. It began with small absences. Nathaniel stopped attending church, where his arrival had once caused a stir after his strange return. His visits to the general store became infrequent, and when he did appear, he seemed distracted, answering questions with short, almost rehearsed phrases. The schoolteacher, Edwin Harper, would later recall seeing Nathaniel one final time, standing at the edge of the village road at dusk. Harper had called out, but Nathaniel merely lifted a hand in a slow, uncertain wave before turning toward the thick grove of pines that bordered the old mill. Days passed. Then weeks. His small rented room above the cooper's shop was found in perfect order, bed made, belongings neatly arranged, but one detail stood out. The single window had been left open, despite it being the start of a heavy rainstorm the night before. On the sill, water pooled around a small scrap of paper bearing a single word, written in Nathaniel's careful hand. Soon, no footprints were found leading away from the building. The muddy street below showed no sign of departure. Some claimed this was proof Nathaniel had simply walked into the pines that evening and never returned, perhaps falling victim to wild animals or losing his way in the marshland beyond. Others, particularly those who had heard his whispered confessions, believed he had gone to meet the fate he'd described to the midwife, his real passing. As he called it, months later, a traveling peddler told a story of meeting a pale man on the road several counties away. The man, according to the peddler, asked for directions to the White Chamber, and when told no such place existed, he simply smiled and walked into a morning fog until he vanished from sight, whether this was Nathaniel or just another tale. To feed the legend, no one could say for certain. What is known is that after that summer evening in 1840, Nathaniel Gray was never seen in the village again. In the years that followed Nathaniel Gray's final disappearance, the story refused to fade. Instead, it seemed to grow, woven into the fabric of local folklore until it was no longer entirely clear where fact ended and embellishment began. Children were warned not to wander into the pines at dusk, lest they walk the road Nathaniel took. Lovers would sometimes sneak to the edge of the grove, daring each other to listen for his voice in the wind, a soft, measured baritone. Said to call out names no one recognized. The midwife who had once treated Nathaniel kept her silence for decades, but in her old age she shared fragments of what he'd told her. She spoke of his belief that he had been sent back for a purpose not yet fulfilled, and of his fear that something or someone was waiting for him when the time came to leave for good. Her accounts, half whispered in the candlelight of her cottage, only deepened the village's fascination. By the late 19th century, writers and amateur historians began to take interest in the case. Articles appeared in regional newspapers with sensational titles like "The Man Who Died Twice" and "Charleston's Returned Ghost." Some presented the tale as supernatural truth, while others argued it was the product of mistaken identity, embellished by decades of retelling. Still, even the skeptics admitted the details were difficult to dismiss. The drowned man's body identified by half a dozen witnesses, the undeniable gap of nearly 2 years, and the unsettlingly consistent description of Nathaniel's second appearance. In the 20th century, Nathaniel's name found its way into books about unexplained phenomena. He was grouped with sailors lost at sea who were later seen alive, with soldiers presumed dead who appeared decades after their last battle. For the locals, however, his legend was more than a curiosity, it was part of their identity. The Pines, near the old mill, became known as Gray's Crossing, a place teenagers dared each other to visit after dark. And the open window above the cooper's shop? It was left untouched for nearly half a century, as if no one wished to disturb whatever passage Nathaniel might have taken, even today. Some claim that on certain mist-heavy mornings you can see a lone figure standing on the far side of the grove, watching. He never moves. He never waves. And when you go to find him, there's nothing there but the silence of the pines. Asterisk over the decades, researchers, skeptics, and believers have all attempted to explain the strange case of Nathaniel Gray. Each theory offers its own sense of closure, or opens the mystery even wider. The imposter theory is perhaps the most mundane. According to this view, the returned Nathaniel was simply another man who bore a striking resemblance to him, one who conveniently stepped into his identity for reasons unknown. Supporters of this theory point to the lack of official photographs and the fragmentary nature of record-keeping in the 1850s. However, detractors argue that too many people, close friends, co-workers, even his own sister, would have to be fooled, and that this stretches belief. The mistaken death theory suggests that the body recovered from the river wasn't Nathaniel at all. River drownings were tragically common, and misidentification could occur when a body was bloated and water damaged. Perhaps Nathaniel, unaware that he'd been declared dead, had been away on private business, possibly of a secretive or criminal nature, and returned only when he believed it safe. While plausible, this still leaves unanswered why he refused to explain his absence and why he seemed, to many, subtly different upon his return. The amnesia and recovery theory posits that Nathaniel suffered an accident, illness, or head injury, causing memory loss. In this version, he wandered far from Charleston, lived under another name, and slowly regained fragments of his identity before making his way home. This theory could explain his hesitance to speak of his missing years, perhaps. He truly didn't remember them fully. But it fails to account for the eerie consistency in his behavior after his return, described by some as more calculated, more measured, and almost foreign. Then there's the supernatural hypothesis, the one whispered most often in taverns and late-night gatherings. In this telling, Nathaniel truly died and, by some means unknown, was returned not entirely as he was. Proponents point to the river's folkloric associations with boundaries between worlds, to the accounts of his voice carrying names no one knew, and to his sudden second disappearance. These believers claim Nathaniel was a man out of place, borrowed back from whatever lay beyond until he was inevitably reclaimed. None of these theories have ever been proven. Each holds its own flaws and unanswered questions. And that, perhaps, is why Nathaniel Gray's story endures, because no matter which path you follow, it always seems to lead you back to the edge of the grove, with the mist curling around the pines and the quiet sense that someone is just beyond sight, waiting. Asterisk in the years that followed Nathaniel Gray's death and second death, as some chose to call it, his story continued to haunt the town of Black Hollow. His journals, meticulously preserved in the small glass display at the local historical society, became a magnet for both serious scholars and the merely curious. People came to read the careful, almost obsessive script in which Nathaniel described visions of an afterlife, landscapes of impossible beauty, and voices that spoke in languages long forgotten. The accounts of his first death in 1839 remain the most discussed part of his writings. Skeptics argued that his descriptions of the other side were the product of delirium, oxygen deprivation, or the fevered imagination of a man steeped in too many religious sermons. Yet others pointed to uncanny accuracies, details about the Deaths of distant relatives Nathaniel could not have known about, and events that had not yet happened but unfolded exactly as he described. These, they argued, could not be explained by chance or coincidence. In the decades after his passing, the church where Nathaniel had once stood and spoken of the realms beyond began to decline. Fewer people attended, and by the turn of the century it was little more than an empty shell, its wooden pews warped by damp air, its pulpit gathering dust. Some said the town's disinterest in traditional worship was the result of Nathaniel's story, a slow erosion of certainty in the doctrines that had once ruled their lives. His testimony had cracked open the door to questions no one could answer, and once open, it could never be shut again. Yet for some, Nathaniel's account was a source of comfort. In the final paragraph of his last journal entry, written with trembling hands, he had described his first death not as an ending but as a homecoming. He wrote of seeing faces he had loved and lost, of feeling a warmth beyond description, and of knowing absolutely that what waited beyond was not darkness, but light today. As the wind whispers through the ruins of Black Hollow's churchyard, and the gravestones lean at tired angles, there is still a quiet reverence around Nathaniel Gray's resting place. People leave flowers there not out of obligation, but in acknowledgement of the strange, unshakable hope he offered. Whether prophet, charlatan, or simply a man who glimpsed something extraordinary, Nathaniel Gray left behind a question that no one has yet answered. What if he was telling the truth?